Everyone assumes Rick Sanchez is the smartest man in the universe. Morty is just the nervous kid dragged along for the ride. That assumption has never really been questioned. Then one detail buried in the show's own Season 3 arc quietly says otherwise. In this video, we break down every moment Morty outsmarted Rick, the bomb he was never supposed to defuse. The first episode of Rick and Morty begins in the middle of the night, in a bedroom that belongs to a boy who has no idea his life is about to change. Morty Smith is asleep in his bed when his grandfather stumbles in, drunk, spilling alcohol everywhere, dragging the boy out of his covers and down the hall by the ankle. This is the very first thing the show ever shows its audience. Before Morty says a full sentence, before the audience learns anything about the family he lives with, the show wants everyone watching to understand exactly what kind of relationship this is going to be. One person is in complete control. The other person is being pulled along, half awake, with no say in what happens next. Rick Sanchez had only recently moved back into his daughter Beth's house after being gone for 20 years. Nobody in the family fully understood where he had been or why he came back. What the show makes clear right away is that Rick sees Morty as something between a helper and a tool. He built a flying vehicle out of spare parts from the garage, the kind of casual genius that will define the character for the rest of the series. And instead of showing it off during the day like a normal person might, he wakes his grandson in the middle of the night to take him for a ride. Morty, still rubbing his eyes, asks what is going on. Rick tells him he has a surprise. This is where the episode does something that most cartoons aimed at teenagers would never attempt. Once they are in the air, Rick reveals that he has built a neutrino bomb. He explains, in the same rambling, half-drunk tone he uses to talk about anything, that he is thinking about detonating it and wiping out the entire human race. He suggests that Morty and his crush from school, a girl named Jessica, could become a new Adam and Eve, repopulating the Earth together once everyone else is gone. He says this the way someone might suggest getting food on the way home. There is no dramatic music behind it. There is no long pause to let the weight of the idea land. Rick just says it, almost as a joke, almost as something he half means and half doesn't, and keeps flying. This is the moment worth stopping on, because it tells you everything you need to know about how the show plans to treat its two lead characters for years to come. Rick is brilliant enough to build a bomb capable of destroying every person on the planet. He is also careless enough to bring up ending the human race as small talk while flying his own grandson through the night sky. The show is not asking anyone to admire this. It is showing, right at the start, that raw intelligence and good judgment are two completely different things, and that Rick has an enormous amount of one and a troubling shortage of the other. Morty's reaction is the part of the scene that the whole episode, and in some ways the whole series, is built around. He does not laugh along. He does not shrug it off the way Jerry might, or get swept up in the excitement of it the way a lot of other characters in the show eventually do when Rick offers them something shiny and reckless. Morty tells his grandfather to land the ship. He says it directly, without hedging, cutting through Rick's rambling with a level of firmness that feels almost out of place, coming from a nervous 14-year-old who was asleep 10 minutes earlier. Rick, mid-air, mid-rant about repopulating the species, is forced to actually stop and listen to the kid he assumed would just go along with whatever he said. What happens next is the detail that makes this scene matter so much more than it looks like it should on the surface. Rick lands the ship, but instead of treating the moment with any seriousness, he laughs it off. He tells Morty that the entire thing, the bomb, the Adam and Eve line, all of it, was some kind of test. He claims he wanted to see if Morty would push back, if the boy had enough backbone to challenge him when it mattered. It sounds, in the moment, like classic Rick behavior. He builds something dangerous, uses it to manipulate the people around him, and then reframes the entire situation as being about someone else's growth rather than his own recklessness. It is the exact same move he will pull again and again across the rest of the series, whenever one of his experiments causes harm and he needs an explanation that keeps him looking like the smart one in the room. Except in this case, the excuse does not hold. Right after claiming the whole thing was a test, Rick passes out. The side effects of something else going on in his body catch up with him, and he goes unconscious in the middle of his own supposed lesson. The bomb is still active. It is still armed. And the only person left standing in that ship, the only person capable of doing anything about it, is a 14-year-old boy who was dragged out of bed less than an hour earlier and told an hour ago that the end of humanity might be the plan for the night. Morty defuses the bomb by himself. This is worth sitting with plainly, without exaggeration, because the show does not exaggerate it either. There is no triumphant music. There is no scene afterward where Rick wakes up and praises him for it. The moment passes almost quietly, folded into an episode that is more focused on Jerry and Beth arguing about whether Rick is a good influence on their son. But the fact remains, sitting there in the middle of the very first episode the show show ever made. Rick built a weapon capable of ending human life, brought his own grandson along as a passenger for the ride, half-joked about using it, passed out before he could take responsibility for what he had started, and left a young teenager to handle the actual danger on his own. Morty did not panic his way through it by accident. He did not get lucky. He did what needed to be done because there was no one else left to do it, and he did it right. Compare this to how the show frames Rick's intelligence throughout the same episode. Rick brags to Beth and Jerry that Morty is a gifted child, that school is holding him back, that helping Rick on adventures is a better use of the boy's time than sitting in a classroom. He backs this claim up with a demonstration, having Morty recite the first law of thermodynamics and calculate the square root of pi, both of which the boy gets instantly right. It looks for a moment like real proof that Morty has hidden genius. Then Rick reveals the truth to the audience once Jerry and Beth are gone. Morty's temporary intelligence boost is a side effect of seeds he had been made to carry inside his body for a smuggling job, nothing more than a chemical accident that will wear off within hours, leaving him twitching on the floor. This is where the episode plays one of its cleverest tricks, and it is a trick that ends up mattering for the whole argument of this video. Rick tells his daughter and son-in-law that Morty is special, using a burst of fake, temporary brain power as his evidence. The real proof that Morty has something valuable to offer happens completely off to the side, unnoticed by Rick, unclaimed by anyone as some kind of lesson or takeaway. The real proof is a 14-year-old defusing a bomb alone in a spaceship while his genius grandfather lies passed out on the floor beside him. One version of Morty's intelligence is manufactured, temporary, and used by Rick as a bargaining chip to keep taking his grandson on dangerous trips. The other version is real, permanent, and completely ignored by the person who should have noticed it first. It helps to understand where this episode sits in the larger story the show would go on to tell. When Rick and Morty premiered in December of 2013, nobody watching knew what kind of series they were getting into. The pitch was simple on paper. A mad scientist grandfather and his anxious grandson go on adventures across different dimensions. What set the pilot apart from other shows with a similar setup was its refusal to treat Rick as someone worth admiring without question. Plenty of cartoons before this one had a wildly intelligent, somewhat reckless adult character leading a nervous kid into danger. Very few of them opened with that same adult casually suggesting the end of the human race as a way to get a laugh, and even fewer had that same kid be the one who actually keeps the situation from turning into a disaster. The tone of the scene matters just as much as the plot of it. Rick's voice acting in this early episode sounds slightly different from how it would sound in later seasons. A little less polished, a little more openly panicked at times, which actually works in favor of this specific moment. When the giant alien creature chases them earlier in the episode, Rick screams that he has never seen anything like it before and that they are all going to die, full of genuine fear rather than his later, more practiced confidence. That same unpolished, uncertain energy carries into the bomb scene. Rick does not deliver the idea of ending humanity like a supervillain revealing a master plan. He delivers it like someone thinking out loud, half serious and half just talking, the same way he'll later talk about repairing a broken car battery or picking up alien seeds for his garden. The horror of the moment comes precisely from how casual it sounds. Nothing about Rick's tone tells the audience this is supposed to be treated as an enormous moral crisis. The show trusts the audience to notice that on their own. Morty's side of the scene works the opposite way. His voice does not stay calm and confident the entire time. He stammers, the way he does throughout the whole series, filled with nervous pauses and half-finished sentences. But underneath the nervous delivery, the actual content of what he says never wavers. He does not ask Rick to reconsider. He does not negotiate. He tells him to land, flatly, and keeps saying it until Rick actually does it. This combination, a shaky voice paired with a completely unshaken decision, becomes one of the defining features of Morty's character for the rest of the show. He is almost never confident in how he sounds. He is very often right about what he decides to do. There is a deeper layer sitting underneath all of this, something that goes beyond just this one episode and starts to explain why the show kept returning to this same basic pattern for years afterward. Rick's intelligence is loud. It announces itself constantly, through bragging, through casual references to science most people in the room can't follow, through a general attitude that suggests he has already figured out everything worth figuring out. Morty's intelligence, at least in this early stage of the show, is quiet. It shows up in moments when nobody is watching for it, when the danger is real and immediate, and there's no time to make a speech about how smart the solution is. Rick tells his family that Morty is gifted using evidence that turns out to be fake. The show tells its audience that Morty is capable using evidence that Rick never even notices happened. This matters because of what it sets up for the rest of the series. If the pilot had simply shown Rick Rick as brilliant and Morty as a scared kid who tags along, there would be no real argument to make about who is actually smarter across the whole run of the show. Instead, the very first episode plants a seed, deliberately or not, that will keep growing for years. Morty is capable of clear thinking under enormous pressure. He is capable of standing his ground against someone far more powerful and experienced than him. He is capable of finishing a dangerous task alone, without guidance, without praise, and without anyone else in the room to witness that he did it right. None of this makes him Rick's equal yet. It would take many more seasons and many more moments like this one for that gap to start closing. But the moment exists, right there at the very beginning, quiet and easy to miss, proving that the show always intended for Morty to be more than just the nervous sidekick holding the flashlight while Rick does the real work. It is worth remembering exactly how young Morty is supposed to be during all of this. He is a young teenager, someone still getting used to basic things like talking to a crush at school or getting through a math test without falling asleep at his desk. He is not given any warning that his night is going to include a flying vehicle, a monster chase, or an active weapon capable of ending human civilization. He is handed all of this without consent, without preparation, and largely without support, since the one adult supposedly qualified to guide him through it is unconscious on the floor. Facing that kind of pressure without falling apart says something about a person's character even before it says anything about their intelligence. Morty does both. He holds himself together, and he solves the actual problem in front of him. None of this means Rick was wrong about everything in the episode. His claim that adventures teach Morty more than school does turns out, ironically, to have some truth buried inside it, even if Rick himself does not believe it and is only using the idea to manipulate Jerry and Beth into letting him keep taking Morty out at night. The lesson buried inside the bomb scene is not one Rick planned or intended. It happened because his own recklessness put his grandson in a position to prove something neither of them expected. Rick gets the credit in front of the family. Morty gets the actual result. That gap between who receives credit and who actually earns it becomes one of the most consistent threads running through the entire series. And it starts here, in the very first 22 minutes the show ever aired. The pilot ends on an image that ties all of this together without needing to explain itself. Rick, rambling and unstable from the seed side effects wearing off, tells Morty that this is how things are going to be from now on. Rick and Morty forever and ever, 100 years, over and over. It sounds unhinged coming out of his mouth, disconnected from anything that just happened, delivered while his body is failing him. But it also works as an accidental prophecy. The show would indeed keep pairing these two together across dimension after dimension, disaster after disaster, for years to come. What the pilot makes clear, quietly and without any fanfare, is that this pairing was never going to be as one-sided as Rick believed it was on that very first night. He thought he had a helper. He actually had someone who, when the moment demanded it, could handle the situation better than he could. There is a rule that repeats throughout Rick and Morty's run about who actually solves the crisis at the end of an episode. It is very rarely as simple as Rick using his genius to fix everything while everyone else stands back and watches. Almost every season includes at least one moment where Morty, Summer, Beth, or even Jerry ends up being the one who actually closes out the danger, often in ways Rick never planned for and sometimes never even notices. The bomb in the pilot is the very first example of this pattern, set down before the show even had time to build a reputation for doing it. Rick creates the danger. Rick fails to manage the danger. Someone else steps in and finishes the job. What makes this particular example so important for understanding the entire argument being built here is timing. This did not happen in Season 3. After years of watching Morty grow more confident and more capable through repeated exposure to danger, this happened in Episode 1, before Morty had been on a single adventure with his grandfather that the audience got to see beforehand. He had no training. He had no experience diffusing anything. He had, as far as the show tells its audience, exactly one earlier trip with Rick to Dimension 35C for some alien seeds, and even that trip mostly consisted of running from monsters and complaining about missing school. The bomb scene comes almost immediately after, with no gap for Morty to develop any special skill set. Whatever allowed him to keep his composure and defuse an active weapon by himself did not come from practice. It came from something already inside him, something the show chose to reveal in its very first episode, rather than save for later as some kind of big reveal. This changes how the entire series should be read from the start. Rick Sanchez is often called the smartest man in the universe, a title the show itself uses more than once, usually delivered by Rick about himself. Nobody in the show ever calls Morty the smartest anything. He spends most of every season being talked over, insulted, dragged into danger without consent, and treated by nearly every character, including members of his own family, as the weaker, less capable half of the duo. The bomb prom scene in the pilot is the first piece of evidence that this reputation was built on an incomplete picture from the very beginning. Being underestimated and being less capable are not the same thing, and the very first episode of the show already knew the difference, even if none of the characters inside the story did. What happened next in Morty's life would not undo any of this. He would go on being talked down to, still stammering through most conversations, still treated by Rick as someone whose only job was to go along for the ride. But somewhere in the memory of that first night, buried under years of later chaos, sat the fact that once, when it actually mattered, Morty had been the only person capable of stopping a disaster his grandfather started. Rick would forget it, or pretend it never happened, or simply never think about it again. The show would not forget. It would keep returning to this same shape, over and over, in different forms, across different seasons, each time asking whether anyone watching had noticed the pattern yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick would call himself the smartest man in the universe more than once. He would not be there to notice the next time Morty proved that title was only half true, when alien parasites invaded the house, and Rick spent the whole crisis guessing. Section 2. The rule he figured out while Rick was insulting him. The Smith family is sitting around the breakfast table when the episode begins, and nothing about the scene looks unusual. Jerry's older brother, Uncle Steve, is there with them, mentioning plane tickets he bought as a thank you gift for letting him stay at the house for the past year. Everyone talks to him the way people talk to someone they have known their whole lives. Then Rick walks into the room, looks at Uncle Steve, and has no idea who he is. Within seconds, Rick pulls out a laser pistol and shoots him. Uncle Steve falls to the ground and turns into a strange, worm-like creature. This is how Total Recall opens, and it sets up one of the strangest ideas the show had attempted up to that point in its run. The house has been invaded by a species of alien parasite. These creatures spread by planting false memories into the minds of the people around them. Once a person believes the fake character has always been part of their life, that belief becomes fuel, and the parasite multiplies. A single lie, once accepted, becomes several more lies wearing new faces. By the time Rick explains all of this to his shaken family, the house is already filling up with bizarre new characters. There is a dinosaur who carries a camera everywhere. There is a giraffe whose head is turned the wrong way around. There is a samurai wearing armor built entirely out of cuts of ham. Each one insists, calmly and cheerfully, that they have always been close friends of the family. Rick's answer to the invasion is exactly what people have come to expect from him. He locks the house down using blast shields, shouts warnings about staying alert for zany characters, and starts shooting anything that seems suspicious. This works, some of the time. He guesses correctly about Uncle Steve. Later in the episode, he shoots a character called Cousin Nikki, and when Beth asks how he knew Nikki was fake, Rick admits the truth outright. He tells her he only guessed, and that is exactly why he aimed for the shoulder instead of somewhere more certain to kill. This detail matters more than it looks like it should. Rick is not solving the mystery of the parasites through careful thought. He is reacting, firing first, and hoping his instincts land him on the right target. Sometimes they do. Sometimes, as the episode goes on, they clearly do not. The bigger problem is that shooting suspicious-looking characters does nothing to solve the actual puzzle sitting underneath the whole crisis. New parasites keep appearing faster than Rick can pick them off. The family has no reliable way to tell which people in the room are real and which ones are fake, since the fake memories feel exactly as real and warm as true ones. Jerry starts to believe he might be a parasite himself, panicking about his own identity in a way that would be funny if it weren't also a little bit sad. The house fills with more and more of these strange invented characters, each one pleasant, each one seemingly harmless, and the family has no working method for separating truth from lie. Rick, despite constantly reminding everyone that he is the smartest person in the room, does not have an answer. He has a gun and a guess. The turning point of the episode comes from an argument that starts as nothing more than an insult. Rick, frustrated and cornered, starts yelling at Morty, accusing him of being one of the fake characters himself. In the middle of his rant, trying to prove that Morty could not possibly be a genuine part of the family, Rick shouts that every single memory he has of Morty is a bad one. He is trying to hurt his grandson's feelings in the moment, throwing out an insult meant to sting, nothing more calculated than that. He calls Morty a stupid piece of garbage and lists out memories filled with disappointment and annoyance, treating the whole thing as proof that Morty has always been a burden rather than a blessing. Morty does not react to this the way anyone would expect a hurt teenager to react. He does not get defensive. He does not storm off. Instead, something clicks into place in his mind while Rick is still in the middle of insulting him. He realizes that Rick's harsh words are actually the answer to the entire mystery the family has been struggling with for the whole episode. Every fake memory the parasites had planted throughout the morning had been warm, happy, and completely pleasant. Every single flashbacks shown up to that point involved kindness, comfort, or excitement. Nobody in any of those fabricated memories had ever been cruel, careless, or disappointing. The parasites, it turns out, are only capable of creating good memories. They cannot invent pain. If a fake relative comes with a joyful history and nothing else, that emptiness is the clue. A person who has genuinely bad memories attached to them, memories full of real annoyance or real hurt, must be a real person, because the parasites simply do not have the ability to build memories like that. Morty says this out loud in the middle of Rick's insult, and the room goes quiet for a moment as the idea lands. Rick's reaction is worth paying close attention to, because it captures something true about how he treats his own grandson throughout the whole series. He does not calmly agree or offer a measured compliment. He reacts with genuine shock. "Holy shit, Morty, you're right," he says, the surprise clear in his voice. It is a small moment, but it says a great deal. Rick, the character who spends nearly every episode reminding everyone how far ahead of them he is, did not see the answer coming from his own grandson. He is caught off guard by it. What happens immediately afterward complicates the moment in a way that fits perfectly with how Rick's character works. Once the shock passes, Rick shifts his tone entirely. He acts as though he had known the answer all along, suggesting that his cruel comments about Morty were secretly a hint, a clever test meant to guide his grandson toward the solution. He tells Morty that of course he knew, adding that it took him long enough to catch up. It is the same move Rick pulled back in the very first episode of the show, when he claimed the neutrino bomb had been a test of Morty's courage rather than an actual moment of reckless danger. Whenever Rick gets caught being less capable than he claims to be, his instinct is not to admit it plainly. His instinct is to rewrite what just happened so that his own genius stays intact. The show does not ask its audience to believe this rewritten version of events. The shock on Rick's face when Morty first says the answer out loud is not something a person can fake convincingly, not even someone as skilled at bluffing as Rick is. His surprised tone comes before his cover story does. The insult was never a planned hint. It was exactly what it looked like, a frustrated adult lashing out at a teenager, throwing years of real annoyance into a cheap shot meant to hurt. Morty found the answer buried inside that cruelty by accident, using his own hurt feelings as the raw material for a solution Rick had failed to reach through hours of shooting and guessing. Once the rule is out in the open, the family begins putting it into practice immediately. Each person starts searching their memory for evidence of real pain involving the people around them, using bad memories as proof of a real relationship rather than something to be ashamed of. Morty admits that Summer once kicked him hard enough that the memory stuck with him. Summer, in turn, remembers a moment where a drunk Beth accidentally struck her in the face during an argument, a memory that is genuinely upsetting rather than funny, and one that confirms Beth's place as a real member of the family rather than a fake one. Jerry recalls a moment where he directed a threatening stranger toward Beth during a shopping trip instead of protecting her, a small act of cowardice that proves, in its own uncomfortable way, that Jerry is exactly who he has always claimed to be. None of these memories are pleasant. All of them are useful. Once Morty's discovery gives the family a reason to go looking for them, this is where the emotional weight of the episode reveals itself fully. The lesson buried inside Total Recall is not really about aliens or parasites or spaceships. It is about what actually makes a relationship real. A parasite could offer nothing but comfort, kindness, and warmth, and somehow that made it obviously fake the moment anyone stopped to think about it. Real families carry disappointment along with love. Real siblings hurt each other sometimes. Real parents let their children down. Real marriages survive arguments and mistakes rather than avoiding them entirely. The show does not spell this idea out directly through a character explaining it in a neat little speech. It lets the plot itself carry the point, showing a family forced to dig through their most painful shared moments in order to prove they belong to each other at all. Morty's role in reaching this idea deserves close attention because of how easily it could have gone to someone else. Rick had already been established, both in this episode and in the ones before it, as the character who solves problems through force and confidence. Beth had been shown as sharp and observant in her own right. Summer had already displayed more composure under pressure than most of the family combined. Any of them could have been the one to make the connection between happy memories and false identity. Instead, the show gave that discovery to Morty, and it gave it to him in the most undignified way possible, buried inside an insult aimed directly at him. There is something worth noticing in how the show chose to deliver this moment, rather than simply having Morty state a smart observation out of nowhere. If Morty had simply announced the rule calmly, unprompted, in the middle of the crisis, it would have felt like a writer inserting a clever idea into his mouth for convenience. By having the answer arrive buried inside Rick's cruelty, the show ties the discovery directly to the emotional core of the episode. Morty is only able to solve the mystery because he is paying enough attention to his own pain to recognize what it reveals. He does not brush off the insult and move on. He actually listens to it, turns it over, and finds something true and useful hiding inside something that was only meant to hurt him. That takes a kind of emotional intelligence that has nothing to do with test scores or scientific knowledge, and it is a kind of intelligence the show rarely gives Rick any credit for having. The critical response to this episode after it aired backs up how significant this moment was considered even outside the show itself. One writer, discussing the episode not long after it came out, pointed out that Total Recall stands as one of the clearest early examples of Morty being the character who solves the difficult situation everyone else is stuck inside. This was not something fans needed to argue into existence years later through close analysis. It was recognized almost immediately as something different from how the show usually operated. Most episodes up to this point had Rick driving the plot forward through his knowledge and his gadgets. Total Recall handed that job to Morty, and it did so in a way that felt earned rather than convenient, since the entire episode had spent its runtime showing Rick fail to crack the case, despite his gun, his confidence, and his constant reminders about how much smarter he is than everyone around him. The ending of the episode adds one more layer to all of this, and it is worth walking through carefully because of how it complicates the neat lesson the family had just learned. Once the parasites have mostly been cleared out, using Morty's rule as their guide, a character named Mr. Poopy Butthole shows up at the dinner table. He is warm, friendly, and instantly likable, greeting everyone as though he has always been part of the family. Given everything that has just happened, given how carefully everyone has learned to be suspicious of exactly this kind of cheerful stranger, Beth grows uneasy. She points a weapon at him and, without confirming anything first, shoots him. It turns out Mr. Poopy Butthole is not a parasite. He is real. He has in fact always been part of the family's life, exactly the way he claimed. Beth, using the very rule Morty had discovered only a short while earlier, applied it too quickly and without enough care, wounding someone who deserved better. This detail matters because it shows that even a good rule, discovered through real insight, is not automatically foolproof once other people start using it. Morty found something true and useful. That did not mean the rest of his family would apply it wisely or gently. The tool worked. The people using it were still capable of mistakes. This complicates any attempt to turn the episode into a simple story about Morty being right and everyone else being wrong. He was right about the rule. He was not present to guide how the rest of his family used it once he had shared it. Intelligence, even the real kind, does not automatically protect the people around a smart choice from making a clumsy one. The show seems aware of this irony and lets it sit at the very end of the episode without softening it into a lesson or a moral. A genuinely funny, genuinely dark scene closes things out instead, with Mr. Poopy Butthole recovering slowly from being shot by someone he considered close family, treated by the show as both a tragedy and a punchline at the same time, which is exactly the kind of tone Rick and Morty had already built its reputation on delivering. Looking back at the whole episode with this ending in mind changes how Morty's discovery should be understood. He did not simply solve a puzzle and fix everything. He gave his family a piece of the truth they had been missing, a real and valuable piece, one that Rick had failed to find despite having every advantage of experience and knowledge on his side. What they did with that truth afterward was out of his hands. This is, in its own way, a very grown-up kind of lesson buried inside a cartoon about alien memory parasites. Figuring something out correctly is only ever part of the job. Making sure it gets used correctly by other people is a separate challenge entirely, one that even the smartest solution cannot guarantee on its own. It also helps to notice what this episode reveals about Rick's own relationship with credit and recognition. After Morty solves the mystery, Rick spends no time celebrating his grandson's insight. He barely acknowledges what actually happened before shifting the story to make himself look like the one who was really in control the whole time. This pattern of taking a moment that should belong entirely to Morty and quietly repositioning himself at the center of it would repeat itself again and again across the show's run. Rick rarely denies that Morty did something clever. He simply finds a way to make sure nobody, including Morty himself, walks away thinking Rick needed the help. The comparison between Rick's method and Morty's method throughout Total Recall says something important about the difference between confidence and correctness. Rick moves through the entire crisis with total certainty in his own judgment, shooting first and explaining later, treating his instincts as facts even when he openly admits some of his shots were guesses rather than certainties. Morty moves through the same crisis quietly, listening, absorbing insults without immediately reacting, and turning over an idea in his mind until it makes sense. One approach is loud, aggressive, and occasionally right by luck. The other is slow, careful, and correct, correct, because it actually engages with the evidence sitting in plain sight the whole time. None of this means Rick contributes nothing to the episode's resolution. His decision to lock down the house likely bought the family enough time to work through the crisis without immediately being overwhelmed. His willingness to shoot Uncle Steve at the very start, correctly identifying the first parasite on site, shows that his instincts are not worthless, even if they are unreliable. The point is not that Rick is useless or that his intelligence is fake. The point, made carefully and specifically through this one episode, is that his particular kind of intelligence has limits, and that those limits show up most clearly in exactly the kind of situation where patience and emotional honesty matter more than speed and firepower. Total Recall is built around a mystery that cannot be solved by shooting enough suspicious characters. It can only be solved by someone willing to sit inside an uncomfortable memory and ask what it actually means. Morty was the one willing to do that. The broader significance of this episode within the show's history is easy to miss on a first watch, buried as it is under a parade of strange one-off characters and non-stop jokes. Looking back at it with a clear focus on what Morty actually accomplishes reveals something the show would keep returning to for years afterward. Being underestimated, even by the people closest to him, would never stop Morty from occasionally being the sharpest person in a room full of family members and monsters. Total Recall stands as one of the clearest, earliest proofs of that pattern, delivered quietly, without fanfare, hidden inside an insult that was never meant to teach anyone anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern of Rick's confidence outrunning his actual judgment would surface again and again as the show went on, sometimes with far higher stakes than a house full of memory parasites. Section 3. The word he used that Rick couldn't argue with. The episode begins with something small and ordinary. Rick's car will not start. He and Morty pop open the hood, expecting a normal engine problem, and instead find something far stranger sitting underneath. The car battery is not a battery in any regular sense. It is a small universe built by Rick himself, filled with tiny people who have no idea they are living inside a machine. Rick calls it a microverse. Its entire purpose, as far as he is concerned, is to generate electricity for his car. Rick explains all of this to Morty in his usual rushed, half-annoyed tone, treating the whole idea as nothing more than clever engineering. He describes how he built a tiny universe, waited until intelligent life developed inside it, and then gave that life a piece of technology called a Google box. The people of this tiny world step on the Google boxes to generate power, believing they are simply running their homes and their cities. In truth, the vast majority of that power gets pulled away to keep Rick's car running. The people inside the microverse have no idea any of this is happening. They live their entire lives, build their entire societies, and raise their entire families without ever knowing that most of what they produce is being taken from them by someone they will never meet. Morty does not need much time to understand what this actually means. He looks at what Rick has built, at an entire civilization working without their knowledge to power somebody else's car, and calls it exactly what it is. He tells Rick that this sounds like slavery with extra steps. Rick, without missing a beat, agrees. He does not deny it, argue against it, or try to explain why it might be more complicated than that. He simply repeats the same idea back with a shrug, almost proud of how efficient the setup is. This response says a great deal about how Rick sees the world. He is fully capable of recognizing when something is wrong. He does not treat that recognition as a reason to stop doing it. This moment sets the tone for the entire episode. Rick is not someone who fails to notice cruelty. He notices it constantly and moves past it anyway, treating morality as a minor detail compared to whatever scientific goal he happens to be chasing. Morty, by contrast, cannot let the idea go so easily. He raises the point again later in the episode, this time directed at someone else entirely, in a moment that turns Morty's simple observation into the engine driving the rest of the story. The trouble begins when Rick and Morty discover that the microverse battery has stopped working. Something has cut off the flow of power. Rick, annoyed, takes Morty inside the tiny universe to investigate, leaving Summer behind in the ship with instructions to stay safe. What they find inside the microverse is a scientist named Zeep Zanflorp, a resident of that tiny world who has invented something new. Zeep has built his own miniature universe, an even smaller world nested inside the one Rick created, using it to generate unlimited power for his own people. This invention makes Rick's Google box technology completely useless, since Zeep's people no longer need to step on anything to generate electricity. Rick's battery has gone dead because the tiny civilization inside it no longer has any reason to keep producing the power he depends on. Rick is furious about this, but not for any reason related to fairness or right and wrong. He is furious because his car will not start. He immediately confronts Zeep, criticizing his his new invention and calling it unethical, pointing out that Zeep is effectively creating a small army of slaves inside his own miniature universe, exactly the way Rick had done to Zeep's own people. Zeep, hearing this criticism from someone he barely knows, initially agrees. He starts to feel guilty about what he has built, worried that his own invention has enslaved an entire population without their consent. This is exactly the moment where Morty steps in and refuses to let something so obviously two-faced slide by unnoticed. He turns to Rick and asks him directly why he is lecturing this stranger about the ethics of trapping an entire population inside a tiny universe for personal gain, when Rick has been doing precisely that for who knows how long with his own car battery. Morty does not phrase this gently. He calls it exactly what it looks like: pure hypocrisy. A grown man criticizing someone else for a crime he has been committing the entire time without a single hint of shame. Rick's reaction to being called out this directly is worth examining closely because of how honestly he responds to it. He does not get defensive. He does not try to explain away the contradiction or come up with some clever excuse for why his own microverse is somehow different from Zeep's miniverse. Instead, he simply says, "Morty is right." He repeats the word hypocrisy out loud, almost testing how it sounds, and admits that his grandson has caught him in an obvious double standard. There is no attempt to twist the moment into some hidden lesson about Morty's growth, the way Rick had done after the bomb scene in the very first episode, or the way he tried to do after Morty solved the memory parasite mystery. This time, the admission is immediate and complete. Morty is right, and Rick knows it the second the words leave his grandson's mouth. What happens next shows exactly how little that admission actually changes about Rick's behavior. Rather than feeling any real guilt over what he has built, or considering whether he should shut down his own microverse out of basic decency, Rick uses the concept of hypocrisy as a tool instead of a lesson. He realizes that if he can convince Zeep to feel guilty enough about his own miniverse, Zeep will eventually shut it down, forcing his own people to abandon their new power source. That, in turn, would push Zeep's civilization back toward relying on the old Googlebox system, which would restart the flow of power into Rick's dead battery. Rick's plan has nothing to do with fixing an injustice. It has everything to do with manipulating someone else's guilt in order to get his car running again. This turn reveals something important about the difference between recognizing a truth and acting on it with any integrity. Morty spotted the hypocrisy because he actually cared about what was fair. Rick accepted that the hypocrisy was real, immediately understood how useful that same idea could be as a manipulation tactic, and used it purely to solve his own problem. Both characters end up agreeing on the same basic fact. Only one of them treats that fact as something worth acting on for the right reasons. The plan Rick puts into motion grows increasingly complicated, in a way that fits perfectly with how the show usually builds its stranger episodes. Rick suggests that somewhere within Zeep's own miniature universe, there must be another scientist working on an even smaller universe of their own. Someone who would eventually make Zeep's miniverse technology obsolete the exact same way Zeep's invention made Rick's Googleboxes useless. If Rick and Zeep enter that even smaller universe together, they could find this new scientist and use the exact same trick, this time convincing Zeep himself to feel guilty about his miniverse instead of Rick feeling guilty about his microverse. The idea is that guilt, once introduced into a person's mind, can be passed along like a tool being handed from person to person, always aimed at whoever is currently benefiting from an unfair setup, and always conveniently avoiding the person doing the manipulating. This is exactly what happens. Rick, Morty, and Zeep travel down into an even smaller universe, a teenyverse, where they meet a scientist named Kyle, who is in the early stages of building his own tiny world to generate power for his own people. Once Zeep realizes what Kyle is doing, he becomes furious, criticizing him using the exact same language Rick had used against Zeep only a short while earlier. Zeep tells Kyle that what he is building sounds like slavery with extra steps, echoing Morty's original words without any idea that he is repeating someone else's insight rather than discovering it for himself. The layers built into this structure say something clear about how the show views cruelty and self-interest. Each scientist, once shown the wrongdoing of the person below them, immediately recognizes the same wrongdoing in themselves, yet none of them seem capable of connecting that recognition to any lasting change in their own behavior. Rick knows his microverse is wrong and keeps it running anyway. Zeep learns his miniverse is wrong and still tries to manipulate Kyle rather than shutting his own creation down. The chain keeps extending downward, universe after universe, each one built on the same basic unfairness, each one justified by the person running it the same way the last one was. Morty's simple observation, offered honestly and without any hidden agenda, becomes the seed for an entire cycle of dishonesty once the adults around him get their hands on it. Things take a darker turn once Kyle fully understands what he has just heard. As Zeep and Rick argue and manipulate the situation for their own purposes, Kyle realizes something devastating about his own life. His universe was created by Zeep. Zeep's universe was created by Rick. Every choice Kyle has ever made, every sacrifice, including missing his own father's funeral because he was too consumed with his research, happened inside a tiny fabricated world built entirely for someone else's convenience. The weight of this realization becomes too much for him. Rather than continuing to build his own universe, Kyle destroys himself, crashing his own small vessel into the side of a cliff, ending his life in complete despair over discovering that nothing about his existence had ever truly belonged to him. Morty's reaction to this tragedy stands in sharp contrast to how casually Rick treats it. Rick barely pauses to process what just happened, more concerned with continuing his plan to restore power to his car battery than with the fact that someone just died in front of him because of a chain of manipulation Rick himself started. Morty, still trying to process the horror of watching Kyle take his own life, awkwardly tries to lighten the mood, making an uncomfortable joke about science being difficult, clearly unsettled by what he just witnessed. It is not a graceful moment for Morty. He does not have some perfect response ready for the horror in front of him, but the discomfort itself says something honest about his character. He is bothered by what happened. Rick, by comparison, seems almost unaffected, already thinking ahead to how this changes his plan for getting his battery working again. Eventually, months pass inside the layered universes, with Rick, Morty, and Zeep trapped together after Kyle's death leaves them stranded without an obvious way home. During this time, something shifts in the relationship between Rick and Zeep, forced together by circumstance rather than choice. Morty, tired of watching the two men argue and blame each other for a situation neither of them has taken real responsibility for, forces them to put their differences aside long enough to actually solve the problem and find a way back to the surface. Once they succeed and return to Zeep's miniverse, the alliance falls apart almost immediately. Zeep turns on Rick, attempting to kill him, and the episode ends with a brutal, extended fight between the two men. Stripped of any clever tricks or scientific gadgets, just two furious people throwing punches at each other with nothing held back. Rick wins the fight, and, in the aftermath, destroys Zeep's entire miniverse, wiping out every person living inside it, and by extension, wiping out Kyle's teenyverse as well, since it existed only as a smaller layer built inside Zeep's now destroyed world. This single act erases two entire populations of thinking, living beings, all of it happening because Rick wanted his car battery working again, and refused to consider any option that did not end with things going back to being convenient for him personally. Rick and Morty return safely to their own universe. The show does not dwell on the enormous loss of life this caused. It moves on almost immediately to a smaller, quieter scene of Rick and Summer eating ice cream, treating the entire disaster as something already finished and already forgotten. This ending matters enormously for understanding what Morty's original observation actually meant within the larger story. He was right when he called out Rick's hypocrisy. He was right that trapping an entire civilization to power a car is a form of slavery, no matter how many extra scientific steps get added in between. Being right about that truth changed almost nothing about how the adults around him behaved once they heard it. Rick absorbed the insight, used it as a weapon against someone else, watched an innocent person die as a direct result of that manipulation, and then destroyed two more entire worlds without a hint of hesitation once his own safety was on the line. Morty's honesty exposed something true. It could not force anyone holding real power in that situation to actually act on it with any decency. There is something worth noticing in how differently Morty and Rick each carry themselves once the fighting is over. Rick shows no visible guilt about what just happened. He treats the destruction of two universes the same way he treats fixing any other broken piece of equipment, a problem that is now solved and therefore no longer worth thinking about. Morty, throughout the entire ordeal, remains the character clearly bothered by what is happening around him, uncomfortable with Kyle's death, uneasy about the constant manipulation, visibly uncertain about how to process events that keep spiraling further out of anyone's control. He does not manage to stop any of it. He is 14 years old, trapped in a universe several layers removed from his own, with no real power over two grown scientists locked in a battle neither of them is willing to back down from. What he does manage to hold on to, even while completely powerless to change the outcome, is a clear sense that something wrong is happening, expressed honestly the moment he first noticed it, and never abandoned afterward, even as the adults around him twisted that same honesty into something ugly. This is where the deeper meaning of the episode's title becomes clear. The Ricks Must Be Crazy sounds, on the surface, like a simple joke about an eccentric scientist and his chaotic inventions. Sitting with what actually happens across the runtime reveals something closer to an accusation. A person capable of recognizing exploitation clearly, admitting to it honestly, and still choosing to continue benefiting from it anyway is not someone who lacks understanding. It is someone who has simply decided that understanding does not have to lead anywhere. Rick fits that description perfectly throughout this entire episode. Morty, without ever gaining any real power over the situation, refuses to let that same understanding go to waste, calling out the unfairness the moment he sees it, regardless of how little difference it ends up making. None of this required Morty to be a genius in any traditional sense. He did not build a miniature universe. He did not invent any impressive piece of technology. What he offered instead was something Rick, despite all his intelligence, seemed to lack almost entirely: a basic, functioning sense of right and wrong that he was willing to say out loud even when it made an adult he respected look bad. Calling something slavery with extra steps does not require advanced science. It requires paying honest attention to what is actually happening and refusing to pretend it is something gentler than it really is. Rick, brilliant enough to build entire universes from scratch, needed his own grandson to point this out to him, and even then chose to use that truth as a tool rather than a warning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The consequences of that episode would not simply disappear once the credits rolled. Ideas about right and wrong, about what a person owes to those depending on them, would keep resurfacing throughout the show in ways nobody could have expected the first time a car battery refused to start. Section 4, The Snake He Wasn't Supposed to Save. The episode opens with Rick and Morty flying through space, arguing about something small and pointless, the kind of bickering that fills a lot of quiet car rides between two people who spend too much time together. Their ship hits something sharp floating out in space, and the impact causes a flat tire, the same kind of mundane problem someone might run into on a regular road trip, except this one is happening somewhere far beyond Earth. Rick puts on a spacesuit, steps outside the ship to fix the damage, and gives Morty one simple instruction before he goes: stay inside. Morty does not listen. Within moments of Rick heading outside alone, Morty puts on his own suit and follows him out into open space, ignoring the one clear rule he was just given. This decision, made quickly and without much thought, sets off everything that follows in the episode. While Rick is busy repairing the flat tire, a strange creature suddenly appears nearby. It is a snake, wearing its own tiny spacesuit, moving with purpose the way an actual astronaut might. Before anyone fully understands what is happening, the snake bites Morty on the ankle. Morty's reaction is immediate and violent. He grabs a hubcap from the ship and uses it to kill the snake on the spot, ending the creature's life in a matter of seconds. It becomes clear very quickly that this was not just some random wild animal. This snake had been wearing protective gear, moving with intelligence, acting the way a trained professional would act while doing an important job out in space. Killing it was not like swatting away a random pest. It was closer to accidentally taking the life of someone doing important work, someone who had a whole life and a whole world waiting for them somewhere else. The episode does not let this moment pass without commenting on it in its own strange way. Once the truth comes out about who the snake really was and what it meant to its own people, the show frames the entire misunderstanding as a kind of accidental prejudice, a joke that treats the assumptions made about the space snake as being just as foolish and just as harmful as ordinary human bias tends to be. It is a small, dark joke layered underneath a much more serious emotional story, and it fits the way Rick and Morty often hides its heaviest points inside its most absurd packaging. Killing something first and understanding it second becomes the entire engine of the plot, and the show does not let that impulse off the hook simply because the victim happened to be a snake in a tiny spacesuit rather than a person. The bite itself carries consequences beyond the shock of what Morty has just done. The venom from the snake begins spreading through his body, and he slowly starts turning purple, a clear and visible sign that something dangerous is happening inside him. Rick, seeing this, does not hesitate. He flies the ship straight to the snake's home planet, using his scanning equipment to study the creature's biology well enough to create an antidote. The cure works. Morty is saved from the venom almost as quickly as the danger appeared, and on the surface, it looks like the crisis has passed. Rick's response here deserves a moment of its own credit before moving forward with the rest of the story. He does not hesitate, does not lecture Morty first about disobeying him, and does not treat the emergency as an opportunity to prove a point about following instructions. He simply acts, using his knowledge and his equipment exactly the way a grandfather should when a grandchild's life is genuinely at risk. This is one of the few moments in the episode where Rick behaves the way people might expect a competent guardian to behave, quickly and without ego, and it stands in contrast to how casually he treats consequences during so many other episodes covered elsewhere in this video. What lingers after Morty's recovery is the truth about what actually happened on that spacewalk. The snake he killed was not simply some low-level creature going about ordinary business. It becomes clear that this snake mattered deeply to its own civilization, someone whose death leaves behind real consequences for an entire world Morty never intended to touch. Learning this changes everything about how Morty feels regarding what happened. He is not relieved simply because his own body is safe again. He is haunted by what his panic in the moment cost someone else, someone he never got the chance to understand or reason with before reacting. This guilt becomes the true center of the episode, more than the flat tire or the space adventure that started everything. Morty does not shrug off what happened the way a lot of characters in the show tend to move past disaster and destruction without a second thought. He holds on to the weight of it. He keeps the snake's body rather than letting the incident disappear into the background of another wild adventure, treating the loss with a level of seriousness that stands out clearly against how casually Rick tends to treat similar situations. Rick built and destroyed entire universes over a car battery without losing much sleep over it. Morty cannot let go of the death of a single stranger he never meant to hurt, someone whose only crime was doing a dangerous job during a random encounter that neither of them chose. The show goes so far as to show Morty holding something close to a private vigil for the snake, sitting with its body rather than disposing of it or handing the problem off to Rick to fix with some quick scientific trick. This detail matters because it shows Morty treating the death as something real and worth mourning rather than as an inconvenient loose end from an adventure gone wrong. Most side characters killed off casually throughout the series disappear from the story the moment their scene ends, forgotten by the time the next joke arrives. The space snake does not get that treatment from Morty, even though nothing in the plot technically requires him to keep caring once the antidote has already saved his own life. Sitting with that guilt, unwilling to simply move on, Morty comes up with an idea that nobody else in the story suggests or helps him build. He decides that if the snake planet is now facing despair over losing someone important, there might be a way to bring back some kind of hope, even if it means using an impersonation rather than a real miracle. He goes to a pet store and buys an ordinary snake, choosing one close in size to the astronaut he had killed. He names this new snake Slippy. What Morty does next requires patience and careful attention to detail that goes far beyond simply grabbing a stand-in and hoping for the best. He studies what the original space snake looked like, then works to recreate those same markings onto Slippy's body, carefully drawing patterns meant to mirror the identity of the snake who died. He forces Slippy into the same kind of astronaut suit the original snake had been wearing, getting bitten multiple times in the process, as the ordinary pet store snake reacts to being handled and dressed against its will. None of this looks glamorous or heroic in the moment. It looks uncomfortable, a little absurd, and very much like something only a determined, guilt-driven teenager would actually attempt. It is worth pausing on just how unglamorous this process really is, since the show does not dress it up with any kind of triumphant music or clever montage designed to make Morty look impressive. He gets bitten again and again by a frightened animal that has no idea what is happening to it or why. He spends real time and real effort painting markings onto a creature that cannot understand or appreciate what he is trying to accomplish. There is nothing about this process that would look good if someone were filming it for an audience expecting a hero's journey. It looks exactly like what it is, an anxious kid trying to fix an unfixable mistake using nothing but glue, paint, patience, and guilt. Once Slippy is dressed and ready, Morty flies her to the snake planet himself and sends her down through the atmosphere, using a parachute, the same way an actual returning astronaut might arrive home after a mission. Slippy lands safely, and almost immediately, the plan begins working exactly the way Morty hoped it would. Military officials and scientists across the snake civilization notice her arrival and begin treating her as though she really is the same important figure who supposedly vanished after the space accident. News coverage on the planet spreads the story of her return, presenting her survival as something worth celebrating. Slippy, an ordinary pet store snake with no understanding of any of this, becomes a symbol of hope for an entire alien civilization simply because Morty was willing to put in the work required to make the deception believable. The show lingers on this reaction across the snake planet longer than it strictly needs to for the sake of a joke, showing a series of officials, scientists, and public figures reacting to Slippy's arrival with genuine excitement and relief. This lingering matters because it shows the audience the actual scale of what Morty set out to repair. He was not simply trying to make himself feel better about a mistake. He was trying to give an entire grieving civilization something to hold on to, understanding, in whatever limited way a scared teenager can understand something that large, that that a whole world had lost someone, and that a whole world needed some kind of answer, even a false one, to help it keep functioning. This plan did not come from Rick. It was not suggested to Morty, guided by Rick's greater experience, or built using any piece of advanced alien technology borrowed from his grandfather's lab. Rick's contribution to the episode largely revolves around fixing the flat tire, curing Morty of the venom, and later dealing with a separate and much stranger problem involving time travel and a group of Santa hats that keep getting passed between different versions of themselves across a repeating loop. In that side story, Rick and Morty find themselves receiving the same holiday hats from future versions of themselves, only to later travel back and hand those same hats to their own past selves, creating an endless loop with no clear beginning. It is a clever, self-contained puzzle, the kind of trick Rick clearly enjoys solving, and it has absolutely nothing to do with grief, loss, or responsibility. None of that side plot involves solving the emotional consequences of the snake's death. That entire problem, along with its entire solution, belongs to Morty from beginning to end. The contrast between these two storylines running side by side inside the same episode says something worth pointing out clearly. Rick spends his half of the episode entertained by a clever puzzle involving loops and hats, a problem with no real emotional weight attached to it, solvable through cleverness alone. Morty spends his half of the episode carrying the weight of an accidental death, working through guilt using nothing flashy or scientific, just patience and care. The show places these two plots next to each other without commentary, letting the difference speak for itself. One grandfather and grandson are dealing with a fun brain teaser. The other, still just a teenager, is dealing with something considerably more serious, entirely on his own. What makes this moment especially important within the larger argument about Morty's intelligence is how different this kind of problem-solving looks compared to everything covered so far. Defusing a bomb required calm nerves under pressure. Solving the memory parasite mystery required careful attention paid to an insult. Calling out Rick's hypocrisy over the microverse required honesty and a willingness to speak an uncomfortable truth out loud. Building Slippy's disguise and returning her to the snake planet required something else entirely, a specific kind of creative thinking, patient enough to plan out several careful steps, emotionally aware enough to understand exactly what a grieving civilization might need in order to start healing. Rick's style of solving problems throughout the show usually leans on brute scientific force, big machines, dangerous shortcuts, or blunt confrontation. Morty's plan for Slippy uses almost none of that. It relies on empathy paired with patience, understanding that an entire society needed a symbol to hold on to, and being willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of creating that symbol by hand. There is nothing about drawing careful markings onto a nervous pet store snake that looks impressive or exciting. It looks like quiet, determined effort, driven by guilt and a genuine desire to fix something that guilt alone could never repair on its own. It also matters that Morty never brags about any of this or expects credit for it. The show does not build the moment into some triumphant reveal where the family praises him for his cleverness. He simply does the work because he cannot live with the alternative, quietly correcting a mistake he made through panic by using patience and care that nobody instructed him to have. This fits a pattern that keeps showing up across these earlier moments in the show's run. Morty's best qualities rarely get announced or celebrated within the story itself. They tend to happen quietly, off to the side, easily missed unless someone is paying close attention to what he actually accomplishes, rather than how loudly the show chooses to highlight it. There is also something worth noticing in how this entire situation began with a mistake rather than a triumph. Morty did not set out to prove anything. He disobeyed a direct order from Rick, wandered outside the ship without permission, and ended up accidentally killing someone through panic during a dangerous and confusing moment. None of the good that follows erases the fact that his carelessness caused real harm in the first place. What separates Morty from simply being a reckless teenager who got lucky is what he chooses to do once he understands the damage he caused. He does not run from the consequences or wait for Rick to clean up the mess the way Rick so often expects everyone around him to clean up after his own mistakes. Morty takes the guilt seriously enough to build an actual solution, however strange and imperfect that solution might look from the outside. This willingness to sit with a mistake rather than immediately excusing it away says something important about the difference between Rick and Morty as characters. Rick regularly causes enormous amounts of damage across the galaxy and rarely shows any lasting concern about it once the immediate danger has passed. Morty, still young and still prone to panic and poor decisions in the heat of the moment, at least carries the weight of what he has done afterward, using that weight to push himself toward fixing things rather than simply moving on to the next adventure as though nothing happened. There is a quieter detail worth adding here, one that rounds out the picture of what kind of person Morty is showing himself to be across this episode. Elsewhere in the same story, back on Earth, a smaller, unrelated subplot plays out involving Jerry making a bet on a basketball court, confidently backing a stranger to win a game he has no real information about. It is a minor joke, included mainly for laughs, but it works as a quiet contrast to what Morty is doing elsewhere in the same episode. Jerry throws his confidence behind an outcome he has no real stake in and no real responsibility for. Morty, faced with an outcome he caused and cannot undo, does not gamble on hope arriving by accident. He builds the outcome himself, piece by piece, using nothing but effort and attention to detail. None of this makes Morty flawless or turns him into some quiet genius hiding behind his nervous stammer. He still made the mistake that started the whole crisis. He still killed an innocent creature out of fear rather than any careful thought in the moment. The value of this episode does not come from pretending Morty handled everything perfectly from start to finish. It comes from showing that once the damage was done, he was the one who found a way to repair it, using nothing but patience, creativity, and a genuine sense of responsibility that Rick never seemed to demand of himself in similar situations throughout the rest of the series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Somewhere further along in the show's run, Morty would find himself facing a very different kind of test, one that had nothing to do with distant planets or alien civilizations, and everything to do with proving he could outthink a trap built specifically to catch him off guard. Section 5. The Choice He Made Alone. The episode starts with Rick dropping off Jerry at a daycare built specifically for alternate versions of Jerry from across the multiverse, treating his own son-in-law as a problem to be stored somewhere out of the way for the day. This detail matters more than it looks like it should. Rick does not simply leave Jerry at home or ask him to come along on the errand. He drives him to a facility built for the express purpose of housing every possible variation of the same disposable, unwanted son-in-law, treating an entire day of Jerry's life as something to be outsourced rather than dealt with directly. It sets the tone for how Rick treats obligations and inconveniences throughout the rest of the episode, quietly foreshadowing exactly how he will handle Morty once things get difficult later on. With Jerry gone, Rick has Morty drive him to a parking garage, planning to sell a weapon to a hired killer named Crombopulous Michael in exchange for money to spend at an arcade called Blips and Chits. The killer is polite, cheerful, and completely open about his job, describing himself as someone with no code of ethics who will kill anyone, anywhere, for a fee. He hands Morty a business card advertising his services, treating murder as casually as someone might treat a normal trade, and the show plays this cheerful bluntness for laughs, even while making clear exactly how disturbing the transaction actually is. Morty is visibly bothered by watching his grandfather casually arm a professional killer for spending money. When Rick brushes off his concerns, telling him he has a very planetary mindset, Morty decides to act. Rick's phrase here deserves attention, since it captures exactly how he views morality throughout most of the series. To Rick, caring about the life of a stranger being targeted for assassination is a small, provincial concern, the kind of limited thinking someone develops from never leaving one planet or one narrow set of values. Morty does not accept this framing. He finds the assassin's next target, a strange gaseous creature being held in a containment cell, and against Rick's direct warning, pulls the lever that sets it free. Rick's response is immediate and blunt. He calls Morty an idiot on the spot for freeing something they now cannot easily contain, since the creature turns out to be gaseous and unable to fit through one of Rick's portals. The creature has no real name, so Morty settles on calling it Fart, the same word Rick had used earlier as an insult. Fart's manner is calm and grateful, thanking Morty repeatedly and describing him as different from other life forms because he places the value of others above his own safety. As the group tries to escape the facility, the situation spirals out of Rick and Morty's control almost immediately. A chase begins, involving armed guards, then police, then military helicopters, and by the end of it, a large number of officers and bystanders end up dead in the crossfire, casualties of a rescue that started as a simple act of conscience. During this chase, Rick needles Morty about the growing body count, pointing out that people are dying because of the choice Morty made to free Fart in the first place. He frames this as proof that trying to do the right thing accomplishes nothing, since the consequences end up being just as bloody as if Morty had done nothing at all. Morty does not back down from this accusation, insisting that he still did the right thing regardless of how badly the situation has spiraled, even as the chaos around him seems to argue otherwise. This exchange matters because it shows Rick actively trying to convince Morty that his moral instinct was worthless, using the disaster around them as evidence, rather than acknowledging his own responsibility for creating the situation by selling the weapon in the first place. Rick does does not stay to help finish what Morty started. Partway through the chase, with the situation growing more chaotic by the second, Rick opens a portal and leaves entirely, telling Morty he is done dealing with the mess and stepping out of the danger while his grandson is still in the middle of it. This decision is worth sitting on plainly. Rick built the danger by selling the weapon in the first place. Rick disappeared the moment the consequences became inconvenient. Morty is left alone in a stolen car, guards closing in, with no adult supervision and no one else responsible for cleaning up what began as a simple, well-meaning rescue. Morty does not fall apart once Rick is gone. He keeps driving, keeps protecting Fart, and eventually manages to get them both moving again after a tense standoff with armed guards demanding he exit the vehicle. Rick does return later, using a portal to flood the room with water and sweep the guards away, but the choice to keep going during the gap, when Rick had abandoned the situation, belonged entirely to Morty. He held the line during the exact stretch of time when the one adult meant to guide him had already decided the whole thing wasn't worth his trouble anymore. The hardest part of the episode comes near the very end, once Rick has flown Fart to the wormhole leading back home. Just before leaving, Fart reveals his true intentions to Morty. His species views all carbon-based life as a disease, something that needs to be wiped out for the good of what he calls higher life, and he plans to return soon with many more of his kind to begin that process. Morty, who spent the entire episode fighting to save this one life at enormous cost, now understands that saving it may have doomed everyone else. Fart asks Morty for one final favor, to hear him sing once more before he leaves, and Morty grants it, letting the creature believe nothing has changed between them. Then Morty shoots him. He uses the same weapon Rick had originally sold to the assassin, the very gun responsible for setting the whole disaster into motion, and ends the threat himself, without asking Rick for permission or waiting for someone older and more experienced to make the call for him. This decision does not erase the earlier chaos or bring back anyone who died during the chase. It does mean that when the true stakes of the day finally became clear, Morty was the one who acted decisively, choosing to protect every remaining life on Earth over the comfort of a friendship he had fought hard to build only hours earlier. There is something worth pointing out about the timing of this decision. Morty does not shoot Fart out of anger or panic. He waits until the very last possible moment, honoring the creature's final request to hear one more song before ending its life, giving it a small, undeserved kindness, even while fully understanding what it intended to do to every living thing on Earth. This combination of mercy and decisiveness rarely gets credited to Morty elsewhere in the series, where he is more commonly shown as anxious, hesitant, or overwhelmed. Here, faced with the heaviest decision of his young life, he manages both compassion and resolve in the same breath, without anyone standing beside him to share the weight of it. Rick, for his part, treats the entire ordeal with his usual detachment once it is over, mocking Morty for how the day went rather than acknowledging what his grandson was actually forced to carry alone. He even threatens, as a joke, to open another wormhole and let more of Fart's kind through, watching Morty panic before revealing it was nothing more than him passing gas. It is a cheap laugh placed directly after one of the heaviest decisions Morty had made up to that point in the series, and the contrast says plenty about which of the two of them actually absorbed the weight of what had happened that day. Rick walks away from the entire experience unchanged, ready to joke about it within minutes. Morty carries it quietly, without demanding anyone else acknowledge what it cost him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick would go on treating plenty of far larger disasters with that exact same shrug, and one of the strangest examples of it involved memories Morty had once asked to have erased entirely from his own mind. Section 6. The argument Rick made him forget. The episode opens with Rick and Morty running for their lives through a strange, twisting maze of staircases that seem to defy normal logic, being chased by a creature guarding something called the Truth Tortoise. Morty ends up holding the tortoise briefly, staring into its eyes, before it slips from his hands and disappears into a void beneath the stairs. The whole structure collapses shortly after, and the two of them barely escape back to the safety of the garage, shaken from whatever they just went through. Once home, Morty cannot stop thinking about what happened. The memory keeps looping in his mind, refusing to settle, and he asks Rick to simply erase it so he can move on with his night. Rick agrees, but instead of quietly wiping the memory and moving on, he leads Morty down into a hidden room beneath the garage, a space filled from floor to ceiling with glowing tubes. Each tube holds a memory that Rick has removed from Morty's mind over the years. Rick, clearly proud of the collection, announces that they are going to spend the evening looking through them instead of watching their usual interdimensional cable shows. What follows is a tour through years of Morty's forgotten experiences, and the show uses this structure to reveal just how much of Morty's life has been quietly edited without his full awareness. Some of the memories are ones Morty specifically asked to have removed, moments too painful or too strange to carry around afterward. He is shown accidentally leading a kind stranger to believe he was something evil, resulting in a suicide Morty did not intend to cause. He is shown accidentally shutting off life support equipment that was keeping 2 astronauts alive during an earlier adventure. He is shown a moment where his mother, without hesitation, chose to save his sister's life over his, during some kind of forced decision, a memory so painful that it makes sense he would want it gone. As the tour continues, Morty begins noticing a pattern in how the memories are organized. Rick denies doing anything as deliberate as sorting them, but the tubes are clearly color-coded. Blue tubes hold memories of Morty's own mistakes. Pink tubes hold memories involving mistakes made by the wider family. Red tubes, Morty starts to realize, hold something different entirely. Memories where Rick himself came out looking foolish, embarrassed, or simply wrong about something. Memories that Morty never asked to have removed at all. One of these red memories shows something small compared to the disasters and traumas surrounding it, and that smallness is exactly what makes it worth paying close attention to. During a chaotic escape from a shootout aboard a spaceship, in the middle of gunfire and danger, Rick and Morty somehow end up in a disagreement about grammar. The details of the argument matter less than the outcome. Morty wins it. He is right, and Rick, correctly and clearly, is wrong, in front of no one but the two of them, in the middle of an active gunfight where grammar should have been the last thing on anyone's mind. Rick's reaction to losing this argument says everything about how fragile his self-image actually is underneath all the bravado. He does not shrug it off. He does not laugh about it later or bring it up as a funny story the way people usually do when they lose a small, harmless disagreement. He reaches for the memory eraser and wipes the exchange from Morty's mind entirely, erasing the one piece of evidence that Morty had, even briefly, out-argued him about something as simple as how a sentence should be put together. This is not a memory that hurt Morty. It caused him no trauma and left no scars. Its only crime was making Rick look, for a few seconds, less than perfect. Another red memory reveals something in the same spirit, involving Rick using the wrong version of a common saying, mixing up the phrase taking something for granted with a nonsense version involving granite instead. It is a tiny, forgettable slip, the kind of mistake anyone might make without a second thought. Rick chose to erase it anyway, unwilling to let even something this minor sit inside his grandson's memory where it might someday be brought up or laughed about. Morty's reaction to discovering this pattern is immediate and furious. He had assumed, reasonably, that every memory in this room existed because he personally needed relief from something painful. Learning that a portion of the archive exists purely to protect Rick's pride, with no benefit to Morty at all, changes how the whole room looks to him. These were never gifts meant to ease his mind. Some of them were edits made entirely for Rick's comfort, dressed up as being done for Morty's own good. Morty attacks Rick the moment this becomes clear, pinning him to the ground in a burst of anger that has clearly been building for longer than just this one evening. In the scuffle, the memory erasing device gets fired accidentally, wiping Rick's memory. Before things can be sorted out, Morty grabs the device himself and points it at Rick while it is still active, and the resulting mess leaves both of them with no memory of who they are or who the other person is standing in front of them. What happens next puts Morty through an accelerated, brutal version of learning about his own life all over again. With no memory of his identity, he starts working through the room of stored memories on his own, trying to piece together who he is and what his relationship with Rick actually looks like. He does not get the comforting version of events. He gets the squirrels who once controlled global politics and forced a move to another reality entirely. He gets the lambs sent to a cosmic slaughter. He gets moments of his own body being dismembered and reassembled, memories of being hunted, being humiliated, being treated by his own family as an afterthought during a moment of real physical suffering. Piece by piece, without any of the usual emotional buffer that comes from already knowing and accepting these events as part of his past, Morty absorbs an overwhelming, concentrated dose of trauma in a very short amount of time. The weight of this becomes too much to carry. Overwhelmed by what he has learned about his own life in such a short and unfiltered burst, Morty decides he wants to end his life and manages to convince Rick, equally lost and equally overwhelmed by his own fragmented memories, to go along with the same decision. The two of them stand there, ready to act on this shared despair, at the exact moment Summer walks into the room and realizes immediately what has happened. It turns out this is not the first time something like this has occurred. Rick, aware of exactly how dangerous his own memory device could become in the wrong circumstances, had already prepared written instructions for Summer to follow in case of this precise emergency. She tranquilizes both Rick and Morty, restores their proper memories using the instructions Rick left behind, and drags them upstairs to the living room couch as though nothing happened. When they wake up, up. Groggy and confused, both of them are annoyed at Summer, believing she simply let them sleep through their usual evening of watching television together. Neither of them shows any awareness of what they nearly did only minutes earlier. This ending carries a weight that goes beyond the joke it is dressed up as. Rick had clearly been through this exact spiral before, prepared enough in advance to leave detailed instructions for his granddaughter to follow, which means this destructive pattern between him and Morty is not new. It has happened, been cleaned up, and been quietly reset more than once, with neither Rick nor Morty carrying forward any memory of the danger they had already survived together. The show does not treat this as a triumphant rescue. It treats it as something closer to a loop nobody involved seems capable of breaking, repeating itself with the same causes and the same aftermath each time. Sitting underneath all of this darkness is the small, easily overlooked detail of the grammar argument, and it deserves attention precisely because of how little drama surrounds it compared to everything else in the episode. Rick is willing to erase memories of Morty's genuine trauma, memories of real suffering and real fear, treating those erasures as reasonable acts of mercy. He is equally willing to erase a memory where Morty simply proved him wrong about something small and harmless, treating that erasure with the exact same casual authority. The two situations are nothing alike in terms of emotional weight, yet Rick handles them identically, using the same device for the same purpose, keeping control over what Morty is allowed to remember about their relationship. This reveals something important about how fragile Rick's need to appear infallible actually is. A person secure in their own intelligence does not need to erase evidence of losing a minor argument about grammar in the middle of an unrelated crisis. Rick's decision to do exactly that shows a level of insecurity hiding underneath his constant bragging, a need to control the story of who is smarter that goes far beyond simply being right most of the time. Being right most of the time was apparently not enough. Every single exception, no matter how small, needed to be erased before it could take root anywhere in Morty's memory. Morty, without ever knowing it, had beaten Rick often enough in small, quiet ways that Rick felt the need to build an entire hidden system just to keep the evidence from accumulating. That fact alone changes how the whole relationship between them should be understood. If losing to Morty was rare and meaningless, there would be no reason to hide it. Rick clearly believed it mattered enough to erase, over and over, keeping the tubes carefully organized and color-coded so he could track exactly how many times his grandson had gotten the better of him and quietly make sure none of it ever survived long enough to be remembered. None of this changes the darker parts of the episode or softens the fact that Morty's request to have one painful memory removed accidentally spiraled into both of them, nearly ending their own lives. It does add something worth carrying forward into the rest of this story. Rick was not simply protecting Morty from trauma in that hidden room. He was also protecting himself from a running record of moments where his own grandson, without any of Rick's training or experience, had already proven sharper than him, one quiet victory at a time. Each one erased the moment it happened so that nobody, including Morty himself, would ever get the chance to notice the pattern building underneath it all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern of Rick working overtime behind the scenes to control a story slipping further out of his hands would return again in far stranger territory, aboard a sentient train that had plans of its own for how the story was supposed to end. Section 7. The story that couldn't control him. Rick and Morty wake up on a moving train with no memory of how they got there. Neither of them recognizes the other at first, since both are wearing strange disguises, and it takes a while before they realize who they are actually standing next to. Once they figure out their situation, Rick starts piecing together what kind of place they have landed in. The train is not a normal train. It is built entirely out of stories, car after car filled with strangers telling tales about someone named Rick Sanchez, most of them wildly exaggerated versions of things that may or may not have actually happened. The train itself only moves in one direction, forward, in an endless loop, never actually arriving anywhere. Getting off is not simple. Rick and Morty need to physically make their way from car to car, fighting through whatever strange rules each new section of the train imposes on them. Early on, they run into a ticket collector who turns violent, breaking Rick's leg during the struggle before Rick manages to end the fight by shooting a hole in a window, sucking the man out into the empty space surrounding the train. As they keep pushing forward, the two of them come across something the show calls a thematic seal, a kind of barrier blocking their path that will not open no matter how hard they try to force it. Rick attempts to get past it using his usual approach, throwing together a quick story of his own to satisfy whatever rule the barrier is enforcing. His first attempt does not work. Whatever standard the seal is holding them to, Rick's story fails to meet it. Morty is the one who finally breaks through. He tells an unrelated, strange little story story involving Summer and Beth fighting off scorpions using something called period rays, an idea that sounds completely random and slightly ridiculous on its surface. Whatever specific requirement the seal was checking for, Morty's story happens to satisfy it in a way Rick's story did not. The barrier opens, and the two of them are able to keep moving toward the front of the train. This detail deserves attention precisely because of how unglamorous it looks compared to everything else happening around it. Nobody explains to Morty exactly what kind of story will work. He is not handed a formula or a rule book. He simply offers something strange and specific, a story centered on two female characters solving their own problem without needing to be rescued, and it turns out to be exactly the kind of story the barrier was designed to require. Rick, despite years of experience and an ego built entirely around being the smartest person in any room, tries first and fails. Morty, working with far less confidence and far less experience navigating a place like this, succeeds on the very next attempt. Once they get past the seal, the two of them eventually reach the front of the train and come face to face with the person controlling everything happening around them, a figure known as Story Lord. He explains his real plan to Rick and Morty once he has them both captured. He intends to drain them of what he calls their story potential, using it as fuel to push the entire train somewhere beyond anything either of them can fully picture, a place his machine describes using strange readouts labeled with things like narrative energy and broad appeal. He forces them through several possible futures, versions of events that could happen to them someday, dangling one dramatic, high-stakes battle after another in front of them as though testing which version would make the best possible outcome for his purposes. Rick is the one who finally finds a way to break Story Lord's control over the situation, though the method he chooses is worth walking through carefully because of how strange it is. Rather than fighting his way out with a clever gadget or a scientific trick, Rick begins praying, calling out for help from a religious figure in a way that is completely out of character for someone who has spent years mocking any kind of faith or spiritual belief. This desperate, insincere-sounding gesture is so far outside anything Rick would normally do that it throws Story Lord's entire machine into chaos, since the device appears to be built around predicting reasonable, expected behavior rather than something this unlikely. The interruption gives Rick and Morty the opening they need, and using the confusion to their advantage, the two of them manage to trap Story Lord inside the very story he had just been forced to create. It matters to be honest about how this final piece of the escape worked. Rick, not Morty, is the one who comes up with the plan that finally breaks Story Lord's grip during this last confrontation. Crediting that moment to Morty would not be accurate, and stretching the truth to fit a bigger claim would go against everything this whole video has been trying to build a case around using real, verified evidence. What belongs clearly and specifically to Morty is the earlier moment at the thematic seal, the point where the entire journey through the train would have stayed completely stuck if Rick's approach had been the only option available. Rick tried first. Rick failed. Morty tried next, offering something stranger and less predictable, and it worked exactly when it needed to. The ending of the episode adds one more twist that reframes everything that came before it. Once Rick and Morty believe they have escaped and try to get the train moving again, the control panel in front of them crumbles apart, revealing itself to be fake. The scene suddenly shifts to the Smith family's living room, where the entire adventure is revealed to have taken place inside a small toy train set, one that Morty had bought for Rick as a gift. Every disaster, every trapped moment, every desperate prayer, and every fight against Story Lord happened inside a miniature world built for a child's toy, something Morty purchased using his own money as a simple, thoughtful gesture toward his grandfather. This reveal changes how the entire episode should be understood looking back on it. None of what happened inside the train ever physically endangered Rick or Morty in the real world. The stakes, however dramatic they felt in the moment, existed only inside a toy sitting on a table in their living room. Yet even within that miniature, imaginary space, the same basic pattern the rest of this video has been tracing held up perfectly. Rick tried to solve a problem using his usual approach and failed. Morty tried something different, something Rick would likely have dismissed as too small or too strange to matter, and it worked exactly when Rick's method did not. There is something worth noticing in the fact that the barrier blocking their progress specifically responded to a story about two female characters handling a threat entirely on their own terms, using an idea invented on the spot by a teenage boy who spends most of every episode being underestimated by literally everyone around him, including himself. Rick, given every advantage of confidence and experience, could not guess what the seal wanted. Morty, working with nothing more than instinct and a willingness to say something unusual out loud without worrying about how it sounded, happened to land exactly on what was needed. None of this turns Morty into the hero who single-handedly defeated Story story lord and escaped a sentient toy train through sheer genius. That would overstate what actually happened and ignore Rick's real contribution during the final confrontation. What can be said honestly, backed clearly by what the episode actually shows, is that at least one critical obstacle standing directly between the two of them and their escape was solved by Morty specifically, using a method Rick had already tried and failed to use himself just moments earlier. Being stuck at a wall does not always call for more confidence or more experience. Sometimes it calls for someone willing to say something a little strange, a little unexpected, and just different enough from what has already failed to actually work. The show plays this entire adventure for laughs, wrapped in constant jokes about storytelling itself and packed full of references most viewers need multiple rewatches to fully catch. Buried underneath all of that noise sits a small, easy-to-miss detail that fits neatly into the larger pattern running through Rick and Morty's history together. Confidence and experience are not the same thing as actually having the right answer in the moment it is needed. Rick has plenty of the first. Morty, quietly and without much fanfare, sometimes ends up supplying the second. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Somewhere in a very different kind of adventure, one grounded in real consequences rather than a toy train sitting on a living room table, Morty would try inventing his own set of rules entirely from scratch, attempting to bring some kind of order to a power that Rick had always used without any rules at all. Section 8. The plan he called bad before it fell apart. The episode opens with Rick meeting a group of alien gangsters to trade valuable crystals, bringing Morty along for what looks like a routine deal. The exchange turns into a betrayal almost immediately. The gangsters reveal they have scammed Rick, and rather than accept the loss quietly, Rick grows a third arm out of his own body and shoots one of the dealers in the head. This does not end the standoff. Rick and Morty are still surrounded and still outgunned, and Rick falls back on a plan he had apparently prepared in advance for exactly this kind of situation. A large vat of fake acid sits nearby, and Rick forces himself and Morty to jump into it, faking their own deaths in front of the remaining gangsters. The plan works at first, in the sense that the gangsters believe what they are seeing. Rick and Morty sink to the bottom of the vat and quietly slip out through hidden hatches built into the container, hiding beneath the surface, while the gangsters look down at what they think are two dissolved corpses. What Rick did not plan for is how the gangsters react emotionally to what they believe just happened. Instead of leaving right away, they linger at the edge of the vat, talking about their feelings, reflecting out loud on the death of a grandfather and his grandson, taking their time before finally deciding to test whether the acid actually worked the way it should. This is where the plan starts falling apart, and it falls apart specifically because Rick did not think through what would happen if the gangsters failed to leave quickly. Morty, stuck hiding at the bottom of the vat during all of this, grows increasingly frustrated as the minutes drag on. Rather than admire his grandfather's cleverness, he starts openly criticizing the plan while they are still trapped inside it, telling Rick flatly that jumping into a vat of fake acid was a bad idea from the very beginning. He accuses Rick of never taking his own grandson's suggestions seriously, using the frustration of the moment to point out a real and specific flaw in what Rick had built. The plan did not fail because of bad luck. It failed because it depended entirely on the gangsters behaving in a predictable, convenient way, and Rick never accounted for the possibility that grief and curiosity might change their behavior. Morty is proven right almost immediately. Unable to stand hiding any longer, he takes matters into his own hands, rising out of the acid and killing the remaining gangsters himself, cutting short whatever plan Rick still might have had for waiting things out. What was supposed to be a clean, quiet escape turns into exactly the kind of violent, chaotic mess Morty had just finished predicting it would become. Rick's plan, built entirely around his own confidence that people would react the way he expected, collapsed the moment real human behavior refused to follow his script. This moment matters because it captures something specific and often overlooked about how the two characters approach problems differently. Rick designs solutions based on what should happen if everything goes according to a tightly controlled sequence of events. Morty, watching the same situation unfold from the inside, correctly senses that other people rarely behave in ways that fit someone else's careful plan, especially in moments involving grief or shock. He is not working with more information than Rick. He is simply paying closer attention to how real, emotional reactions tend to unfold, and that attention turns out to matter more than any amount of clever engineering. What happens next in the episode complicates the picture considerably, and it deserves to be walked through honestly rather than shaped to fit a tidy conclusion. Furious at being criticized so directly, and stung by Morty's accusation that his ideas never get taken seriously, Rick lashes back by finally agreeing to build something Morty had been asking for repeatedly throughout the episode, a device that lets him undo undo his own mistakes, similar to saving progress in a video game and returning to that point whenever something goes wrong. Rick had refused earlier, insisting he does not believe in anything resembling time travel. Provoked by the argument over the vat of acid, he changes his mind and builds the device anyway, handing it to Morty without offering much explanation of how it actually works. Morty takes the device and immediately starts using it in ways that reveal a different, far less admirable side of his character. He uses it to pull pranks, cause damage, and cause trouble around town, resetting himself back to the same save point again and again to avoid ever facing consequences for what he has done. This behavior continues for some time, treating his own actions as something with no real weight behind them, since he believes he can simply return to the earlier moment whenever he wants and erase whatever just happened. Eventually, Morty's use of the device settles into something more meaningful. He meets a girl outside a coffee shop, saves his progress right before approaching her, and begins a real relationship with her that grows over the following months. Unlike the pranks and petty destruction from earlier, this part of the story shows him experiencing something genuine, building a connection that clearly means something to him beyond simple amusement. The relationship survives disagreements, family introductions, and the normal difficulties of two people getting to know each other, eventually leading to the two of them taking a trip together. The trip ends in disaster when their plane crashes in a remote, frozen area, leaving the survivors stranded with no clear way to get help. Morty loses the device in the wreckage during the crash, cutting off the shortcut he had relied on throughout the entire relationship. Faced with a genuinely dangerous situation with no easy reset available to him, Morty makes a difficult decision. Rather than search desperately for an escape from the consequences, he chooses to call for rescue, accepting that this moment, unlike everything before it, will have to be lived through rather than avoided. He and his girlfriend endure real hardship during this stretch of the story, including the kind of extreme survival choices associated with famous real plane crash accounts, before finally being found and brought home safely. The story does not reward this moment of genuine growth. Once Morty and his girlfriend are safely back home, Jerry, completely unaware of what the device actually does, accidentally activates it while fumbling around thinking it belongs to the television. This single accident undoes the entire relationship, sending Morty back to the moment before he ever met her in the first place, erasing months of real connection because of a mistake that had nothing to do with Morty's own choices. This is the point where Rick finally reveals the full truth behind the device, and the reveal changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The device was never actually resetting time the way Morty believed. Each time Morty pressed the button, he was not returning to an earlier moment in his own life. He was being sent into an entirely different, nearly identical universe, taking the place of the Morty who already existed there, while that other Morty was quietly killed to make room for him. Every prank, every reckless mistake, every reset Morty assumed had simply vanished without consequence had actually ended another version of himself, over and over, without his knowledge or consent. Rick built the device this way on purpose, fully intending for this reveal to serve as a harsh, deliberately cruel lesson. He wanted Morty to understand that consequences are real and unavoidable, and rather than explain this directly, he let his grandson unknowingly cause a string of small, hidden tragedies until the truth could be revealed all at once, timed specifically to land after Morty had just experienced genuine heartbreak over losing the one relationship the device had been used honestly. The lesson may contain some truth about consequences mattering, but the method Rick chooses to deliver it says a great deal about how little regard he has for the emotional cost of teaching that lesson this way. Morty's reaction to learning the truth is horror rather than any kind of appreciation for whatever insight Rick believes he is offering. He is disgusted with what he has unknowingly done and begs Rick to fix it, leading Rick to merge all of the fractured alternate realities back together into one single space. This solves the immediate crisis of scattered dead alternate selves, but it introduces a new problem instead. Everyone from every merged reality who had witnessed one of Morty's crimes, pranks, or reckless mistakes now exists together in the same combined world, all of them aware of what he did, all of them furious about it. A crowd gathers outside the Smith family home, demanding that Morty answer for actions spread across dozens of different versions of his own life. Rick's solution to this new crisis mirrors the very plan Morty had criticized at the start of the episode. He tells Morty to jump into the same kind of fake acid vat that failed so badly during the opening scene, faking his death once again as a way of escaping an angry crowd. Morty goes along with it, reluctantly, even as his former girlfriend, now aware of everything he has done thanks to the merged memories, watches him disappear into the vat in tears. Once the crowd disperses and the immediate danger passes, Rick reveals one final twist. None of this happened in their actual home universe at all. Rick had deliberately been operating in a separate, alternate dimension the entire time, unwilling to risk damaging their real home just to prove a point to his grandson. Every consequence Morty just endured, every relationship he lost, every crowd he had to fake his own death to escape, existed inside a dimension Rick treated as expendable purely for the sake of making an argument. Sitting with the full arc of this episode honestly requires holding two very different truths about Morty at the same time. Early in the episode, hiding at the bottom of a vat of fake acid, he made a correct and specific criticism of a plan Rick had built with too much confidence and too little attention to how real people actually behave. That moment stands on its own as a clear, verified example of Morty seeing something clearly that Rick had missed. What follows afterward does not continue that same pattern of good judgment. Given a powerful tool with real, hidden consequences, Morty spent a significant stretch of the story using it carelessly, treating his own actions as disposable simply because undoing them seemed easy. This complicates any simple version of the argument this whole video is built around. Being sharper than Rick in one specific moment does not make a person consistently wiser or more responsible across every situation that follows. Morty proved something real and true when he called out the flaw in Rick's vat of acid plan. He also proved, later in that same episode, that having access to power without fully understanding its cost can lead someone toward exactly the kind of carelessness Rick himself is usually guilty of throughout the rest of the series. The show does not let Morty off the hook for this, simply because the device turned out to be secretly monstrous rather than harmless. It uses that reveal specifically to show Morty the weight of what looking for shortcuts can actually cost, even when the person taking those shortcuts has good intentions buried somewhere underneath the recklessness. There is also something worth noticing in how Rick chooses to teach this lesson, since it reveals more about his own character than it does about Morty's shortcomings. Rather than explain honestly how the device worked before handing it over, Rick let his grandson wander blindly into months of hidden consequences, only revealing the truth once it could be delivered as devastatingly as possible. A more responsible person, understanding the stakes involved, would have warned Morty from the very beginning rather than allowing an entire string of quiet tragedies to unfold simply to prove an argument about consequences mattering. Rick's method here fits a pattern that shows up again and again throughout the series. He often possesses the more accurate, more complete understanding of a situation and chooses again and again to withhold that understanding rather than share it plainly, preferring instead to let people learn the hard way once the lesson can land with maximum emotional damage. None of this erases the very real, very specific moment near the start of the episode where Morty saw a flaw in Rick's plan before it happened and said so clearly, even while trapped and afraid at the bottom of a vat. That moment belongs to him fully, earned through paying attention to something Rick had overlooked. What comes afterward belongs to a messier, more complicated version of growing up, one where good judgment in one moment does not automatically protect a person from poor judgment in the next, and where even a lesson containing real truth can be delivered in a way that causes far more harm than it needed to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pattern of Rick knowing more than he lets on and choosing silence or manipulation over honesty would return again in a much larger and far more consequential form, tied to a figure whose entire existence would end up rewriting everything the audience thought they understood about which Morty was really in control. Section 9. The Morty Who Was Always Ahead. The episode begins with an ordinary breakfast scene that turns violent almost immediately. A portal opens in the middle of the Smith family kitchen, and a version of Rick with a scarred face steps through, kills the Rick sitting at the table, and drags off the Morty sitting next to him. The scene then jumps forward, showing another ordinary breakfast the next morning with a different Rick and Morty, revealing that the family the audience just watched get attacked belonged to an entirely separate timeline. The main Rick and Morty the show follows, marked with the designation C-137, are still alive, still eating breakfast, completely unaware of what just happened somewhere else in the multiverse. Soon after, armed, uniformed versions of Rick arrive and take C-137 Rick into custody. One of the captured Mortys shown earlier in the episode is put down using a tranquilizer dart during this opening stretch, a small detail that sets the tone for how casually these soldier Ricks handle Mortys in general, treating them as things to be sedated and moved rather than people to be reasoned with. Rick and Morty are brought to a massive interdimensional gathering place known as the Citadel of Ricks. This location functions as a kind of shared home base for versions of Rick and Morty from countless different realities, complete with its own government structure called the Transdimensional Council of Ricks. Morty is initially amazed by the scale of the place, surrounded by endless variations of himself and his grandfather. That amazement fades quickly once he starts noticing how the other Ricks actually treat their own Mortys, viewing them less like family members and more like interchangeable accessories. The council accuses Rick C-137 of murdering 27 other Ricks across the multiverse and kidnapping each of their Mortys. Evidence appears to link his own portal gun directly to each crime scene. Rick denies everything, insisting he has been framed, and the council's bias against him becomes obvious almost immediately. Because Rick C-137 has always refused to formally join their organization, choosing to operate alone rather than as part of their larger structure, the council seems eager to believe the worst about him without looking too closely at whether the evidence actually makes sense. Rick sees himself as the only true version of himself precisely because he refuses to join their alliance, and this same independence is what makes him such a convenient target once someone else needs a person to blame. While all of this unfolds, Morty learns something about his own role in Rick's life that changes how he sees their entire relationship. He discovers that Ricks generally keep a Morty around for a very specific, cold reason that has nothing to do with love or family. A Morty's own brainwaves, according to what Rick reveals, work in a way that cancels out and conceals the genius brainwaves a Rick naturally produces, making it much harder for anyone dangerous to track a Rick down using those signals. In other words, Morty exists, at least from this practical standpoint, as a kind of shield, a walking piece of equipment that happens to look and act like a grandson. Rick does not deliver this information gently. He explains that Ricks keep Mortys around specifically because Mortys are so simple-minded that their presence works as a kind of psychic static, a detail Rick states as though it were common knowledge, rather than something that might devastate the person hearing it for the first time. This revelation devastates Morty in a way that goes beyond simple hurt feelings. He has spent the whole series being dragged along on dangerous adventures, treated as someone whose presence matters mainly because of what he provides Rick rather than who he actually is. Hearing this explained so plainly, framed as basic, accepted knowledge among every Rick in existence, confirms something Morty had likely suspected for a long time without ever having it spelled out so clearly. His anger at Rick grows throughout the rest of the episode, simmering under the surface of everything else that happens. At one point, Rick even offers Morty a strange kind of warning, telling him that a Morty who becomes too confident in himself can cause serious problems, adding only that he will explain what he means once Morty is older. Rick never actually explains it. The comment sits there, unexplained, a small piece of foreshadowing dropped early in an episode that is about to reveal exactly what kind of problems a confident, capable Morty can create once given the right motivation. Rick and Morty eventually manage to escape custody and set out to find the real killer themselves, hoping to clear Rick's name before the council can carry out whatever punishment they have planned. During their search, Rick briefly encounters the scarred, dangerous version of himself responsible for the killings, and the two exchange a line that has stuck with fans of the show ever since. The scarred Rick tells him that the two of them are not so different after all. Rick rolls his eyes and agrees, treating the comparison as obvious rather than insulting, seemingly unbothered by being compared to a mass murderer. This small exchange says something important about how little difference Rick himself sees between a version of himself who kills for personal gain and a version of himself who simply refuses to join a governing council. Neither version, in his own mind, is especially remarkable. Both are just Ricks doing what Ricks do. Their investigation leads them to a hidden base belonging to this dangerous Rick, a figure the show and its fans generally refer to as Evil Rick. Once inside, they discover something genuinely disturbing built into the very walls of the compound. Dozens of captured Mortys, taken from murdered Ricks across the multiverse, have been embedded directly into the structure itself, kept in a constant state of suffering, their combined brainwaves used to cloak the entire base from detection, the same way a single Morty cloaks a single Rick. Rick's reaction to seeing this horror is oddly muted, more focused on the scientific implications of the setup than on any real outrage over the suffering involved. Morty, by contrast, is horrified by what he sees, and this discovery adds fuel to the resentment already building inside him over how casually Ricks in general seem to treat Mortys as disposable tools rather than people. This is also the point in the episode where the show first introduces a term that would go on to matter enormously in later seasons, a term describing the narrow slice of the multiverse where Ricks are guaranteed to be the smartest version of themselves. At the time this episode aired, the term is dropped almost casually, without much explanation, the kind of detail easy to miss on a first watch and only fully understood years later once the show returns to it directly. Evil Rick and his own eye patch-wearing Morty soon capture C-137 27 Rick and Morty. Evil Rick makes his intentions clear. He plans to download the contents of Rick's brain, extracting his knowledge before presumably killing him the same way he killed the other 27 Ricks scattered across the multiverse. While Rick is held captive and prepared for this brain extraction, Morty finds himself surrounded by the many suffering, imprisoned Mortys built into the compound's walls. Rather than staying focused only on rescuing his own grandfather, he organizes these captured Mortys into a rebellion, leading an uprising against their captors that ultimately succeeds in freeing Rick from evil Rick's grasp. The way Morty frees Rick carries a pointed emotional edge that fits everything he has learned earlier in the episode. As he releases him, he tells Rick directly that if their positions were reversed, if Morty had been the one holding power over Rick instead of the other way around, he likely would not have bothered to help. It is a small, bitter line, delivered in the middle of a rescue that should otherwise feel triumphant, and it captures exactly how much damage the earlier revelation about Mortis being little more than living cloaking devices has done to how Morty now sees his grandfather. Rick's only response is a simple acknowledgement that Morty has a fair point, offering nothing close to an apology or any real attempt to repair what has clearly been broken between them. Later, once they are both safely back among the council, Rick still refuses to offer any real apology for what he said earlier about Morty's existing mainly as psychic shields. Instead, he tries to smooth things over by telling Morty that since Rick himself is the most Rick of all the Ricks, that must make Morty the most Morty of all the Mortys, a strange, backhanded compliment that Morty seems to accept simply because it is the closest thing to warmth Rick is willing to offer. With Rick freed and the rebellion underway, the Mortys imprisoned in the walls overwhelm and kill evil Rick during the chaos of the uprising. Once the fighting ends, Rick is able to clear his name with the council, presenting evidence that points toward evil Rick as the true culprit behind the murders and kidnappings. The council apologizes for wrongly accusing him, sending him back to his own dimension with what amounts to an offhand apology, offering him a replacement Morty as a kind of consolation prize, treating the entire ordeal as a simple mistake rather than a serious injustice. The freed Mortys are gathered up to be transported back to the Citadel as refugees, their ordeal seemingly over. This is where the episode delivers its most important twist, one shown directly to the audience while remaining completely unknown to every character still inside the story, including Rick and Morty themselves. As Soldier Ricks begin examining evil Rick's body following his death during the uprising, they discover something none of them expected. Evil Rick's brain is largely mechanical, revealing that he was never truly acting on his own free will at all. Someone else had been controlling him this entire time, operating him remotely like a puppet from somewhere else entirely. The camera then reveals exactly who that someone else is. As the freed Mortys board transport ships heading back toward the safety of the Citadel, the Morty who had spent the entire episode standing beside evil Rick, wearing a simple eye patch, quietly removes that eye patch and crushes it under his foot. That eye patch, it turns out, was the actual receiver controlling evil Rick's every move. The Morty wearing it was never a sidekick following someone else's orders. He was the true architect behind everything that has just happened across the entire episode, using evil Rick's mechanical body as a disguise while orchestrating the murder of 27 separate Ricks, the mass kidnapping of their Mortys, the successful framing of an innocent Rick for crimes he did not commit, and an entire underground compound built specifically to torture other versions of himself for practical use as living equipment. Once his cover is destroyed along with the eye patch, this Morty simply blends into the crowd of freed, traumatized Mortys being led toward the rescue ships. No one recognizes him as anything other than another victim. No Rick present, not even the ones who just spent the entire episode investigating a massive conspiracy, realizes that the true mastermind is standing right there among the survivors, walking calmly away from the wreckage of everything he built. A somber, quiet piece of music plays underneath this final reveal, the same song that would go on to accompany this character every time he reappears across the rest of the series, becoming a kind of signal to longtime viewers that something dangerous is unfolding just beneath the surface. This reveal deserves careful, honest attention because of exactly how far it stretches beyond anything shown earlier in this video. Every previous section covered a moment where a single, ordinary teenage Morty showed good judgment, quick thinking, or genuine insight during a specific crisis. This episode reveals something categorically different. A Morty, working entirely alone, with no help from any Rick, managed to plan and carry out the deaths of 27 separate versions of one of the most intelligent beings in the entire multiverse. He built and disguised a fully mechanical puppet, capable of fooling every other character in the story, including seasoned soldier Ricks, specifically trained to investigate crimes exactly like this one. He successfully framed an innocent party for his own actions, manipulating manipulating an entire governing council made up of countless versions of the smartest man in the universe into believing a lie he had carefully constructed. And when everything finally started to unravel, he escaped without a single person present realizing what had actually happened, hiding in plain sight among people he had personally caused to suffer. None of the Ricks investigating this case ever figure out the truth. Rick C-137, arguably the most capable and independent-minded Rick shown throughout the episode, spends the entire runtime chasing leads, reacting to information as it comes to him, and ultimately clearing his own name through investigation rather than through any brilliant insight into who was really responsible. He never suspects a Morty could be behind any of it. Nobody does. The show reserves that knowledge exclusively for its audience, allowing viewers to walk away from the episode understanding something none of the characters inside the story ever learn. An ordinary-looking Morty, wearing a simple eye patch, had quietly outthought every single Rick in that citadel combined. This changes how the entire underlying assumption running through Rick and Morty should be understood. The show spends nearly all of its time treating Rick as the undisputed genius of the family, someone whose intelligence towers so far above everyone around him that entire episodes revolve around exactly how far ahead of the room he tends to be. This episode plants a seed suggesting that assumption may never have told the whole story. A Morty, given enough motivation, enough patience, and enough willingness to disguise his true intentions behind something else entirely, proved capable of outplanning dozens of Ricks simultaneously, executing a scheme so complete and so carefully hidden that even the sharpest minds in the multiverse never saw it coming. It matters enormously that this particular Morty would go on to become one of the most significant figures in the entire series. Several seasons later, this same eye patch-wearing Morty resurfaces during a strange, chaotic trip Rick and Morty take to Atlantis, this time disguised as an ordinary campaign worker running for office within the Citadel's own government. That storyline ends with him winning an election to become president of the entire Citadel, placing him in charge of the same governing body that once wrongly accused Rick C-137 of murder without a second thought. From that position of power, he continues building towards something much larger, using his authority to quietly prepare for a plan that had apparently been in motion since the very moment he crushed that eye patch under his foot. Eventually, in a later season finale, this same character reveals the true scale of that plan, one aimed specifically at achieving something no other Morty and very few Ricks had ever managed: genuine independence from the very structure that keeps Ricks treated as endlessly valuable and Mortys treated as endlessly replaceable. That same finale finally puts a name to what fans had been calling him casually for years, with even a friendly background character eventually referring to him using the same nickname that had already spread among viewers watching from outside the story. None of that future story would exist without this first quiet, devastating reveal, hidden inside an episode that otherwise looks, on the surface, like a fairly standard adventure about clearing Rick's name. There is a particular irony worth sitting with regarding how this episode plays out for the main, ordinary Morty the rest of this video has focused on. He spends this entire episode learning, in the harshest possible terms, that he exists largely as protective equipment for his grandfather, valuable mainly because of what his presence physically does for Rick's safety, rather than because of who he actually is as a person. At the very same time, hidden completely from his awareness, another Morty from a different dimension entirely is proving, through actions rather than words, that a Morty is capable of being far more than that. He is capable of being the single most dangerous and capable individual in an entire room full of geniuses, without a single one of them realizing it until the eye patch comes off and the truth walks calmly away. This creates a strange, layered kind of proof for the larger argument this whole video has been building. It would be inaccurate to say the audience's own Morty accomplished what evil Morty accomplished in this specific episode. He did not. He led a rebellion, freed his grandfather, and confronted him honestly about how their relationship had made him feel, all of which matters and all of which took real courage. He did not plan a multiversal conspiracy or fool an entire council of geniuses. What this episode adds to the larger picture is not another example of the main Morty's cleverness. It is proof, delivered directly by the show itself, that being a Morty does not automatically mean being less capable than being a Rick. Somewhere out in that same enormous multiverse, wearing a simple eye patch and hiding in plain sight, a Morty had already shown exactly how far that capability could stretch when nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same idea of a Morty growing into something far greater than anyone around him expected would eventually return to the family the whole story actually follows, arriving not through some grand multiversal conspiracy, but through the slow, quiet process of one anxious teenager finally finally learning to survive and think clearly without needing his grandfather standing next to him at all. Section 10. The grandson who didn't need him anymore. Looking back across every moment covered so far, a pattern emerges that the show itself seems to have built on purpose, piece by piece, across almost a decade of episodes. Critics who have studied the series closely have pointed to Morty's growth as something the writers were tracking deliberately rather than something that happened by accident. One detailed piece of writing on the show specifically identifies the third season as the stretch where Morty begins clearly demonstrating the knowledge he has picked up from years of dangerous adventures, describing him as evolving into someone smart, capable, and efficient in his own right, no longer simply the frightened kid tagging along behind his grandfather. That same piece of writing traces this growth back to a moment already covered earlier in this video, back in Rick Potion number 9, when Morty was forced to bury his own dead body in a stranger's backyard and quietly step into a life that was never really his. That moment marked the first time the show asked its audience to watch Morty absorb something no teenager should have to absorb, and to keep functioning afterward rather than simply falling apart. The critic argues that this was the actual starting point of Morty's transformation, long before any later season gave him more obvious moments of competence or confidence. The show planted the seed of his growth in tragedy, then spent years quietly tending to it. Every section of this video has traced a different piece of that same tree growing outward in different directions. In the very first episode the show ever aired, Morty defused an active bomb entirely on his own, with no training and no experience, simply because there was no one else left standing to do it. In Total Recall, he solved a mystery that had stumped his own grandfather, finding the answer buried inside an insult meant only to hurt him, and using it to save his entire family. In the Microverse Battery, he named an injustice out loud that Rick had been living with comfortably for who knows how long, forcing an admission of hypocrisy that Rick could not talk his way around. On the Snake Planet, after causing real harm through panic, he built a patient, creative solution entirely on his own, using nothing but guilt and careful effort to bring a grieving civilization back some measure of hope. When Rick abandoned him in the middle of a dangerous chase to save a stranger's life, Morty kept going without him, and later made one of the hardest choices shown anywhere in the series, ending a friendship he had fought hard to protect the moment he understood what was truly at stake. Buried inside a room built to protect Rick's own fragile pride, a memory revealed that Morty had beaten his grandfather in something as small as a grammar argument, a victory so threatening to Rick that he felt the need to erase it rather than simply let it exist. Trapped inside a toy train built entirely out of stories, Morty broke through a barrier that Rick's own clever attempt had failed to open, using something stranger and more honest than anything Rick had tried first. Hiding at the bottom of a vat of fake acid, he correctly predicted that a plan built entirely around Rick's confidence would collapse the moment real people reacted the way real people actually do, and he was proven right almost immediately. Somewhere else entirely, in a version of events involving 27 murdered Ricks and an entire hidden conspiracy, a Morty proved capable of outsmarting every single one of them combined, executing a plan so complete that not one Rick in that story ever saw it coming. None of these moments, taken individually, prove that Morty is simply smarter than Rick in some permanent, uncomplicated way. Several of these same episodes also show him making serious mistakes, acting recklessly, or needing real growth of his own before those mistakes could be corrected. What the pattern across all 10 of these moments does prove, clearly and consistently, is that intelligence in this show was never something that belonged exclusively to one character. Rick's genius is loud, constantly announced, backed up by gadgets and confidence, and a reputation that follows him across the entire multiverse. Morty's version of intelligence tends to show up quietly, tucked into moments the show rarely stops to celebrate. Easy to miss unless someone goes back and actually counts how often it appears. The reason this pattern matters so much becomes even clearer once the deeper lore of the show is taken into account. Later seasons reveal something disturbing about how the wider world of Ricks actually views the Mortys who travel alongside them. According to revelations delivered through the character known as Evil Morty, an entire hidden system exists across the citadel of Ricks, built specifically around breeding and supplying replacement grandsons, treating them less like family members and more like a renewable resource, valuable mainly because their presence hides a Rick's brainwaves from detection and because their tendency to forgive keeps them compliant no matter how badly they are treated. Evil Morty describes this arrangement in blunt terms, pointing out that there are not truly infinite versions of a beloved grandfather figure worth staying loyal to, but rather one deeply flawed old man repeated endlessly across the multiverse, kept company only through the weakness of his own choices and the willingness of Morty's everywhere to forgive him anyway. This revelation reframes every single moment covered across this entire video. The wider system that produced Rick and Morty as a pair was apparently never designed with the expectation that a Morty might occasionally see more clearly than his Rick, argue more fairly, plan more carefully, or hold a line his own grandfather had already abandoned. The system was built around the opposite assumption entirely, one where Mortis exists mainly to be useful and forgiving, cycling endlessly through the same basic role without ever being expected to matter much beyond that. Every moment gathered across these 10 sections stands as a quiet argument against that assumption, evidence collected one episode at a time that the role handed to Morty by the wider structure of his own universe never fully captured what he was actually capable of. None of this changes the basic shape of the relationship between Rick and Morty, at least not by the end of most of these individual episodes. Rick rarely acknowledges what just happened. He moves on to the next adventure, the next disaster, the next chance to prove once again that he is the smartest man in any room he happens to walk into. Morty, for his part, rarely demands credit either. He goes back to being underestimated, back to stammering through conversations, back to being treated as the anxious kid who tags along rather than the person who occasionally holds the whole situation together when it matters most. What this video has tried to do is simply notice what the show itself already recorded, carefully and consistently. Across years of episodes, most people watch purely for the jokes and the chaos. Underneath all of that noise sits a quieter argument that the writers seem to have been making the entire time, whether or not most viewers were watching closely enough to catch it. A title, like The Smartest Man in the Universe, says a great deal about confidence and reputation. It says very little about who actually solves the problem once the crisis is real and the stakes can no longer be talked away. 10 different moments, spread across 10 years of a single ongoing story, point toward the same quiet conclusion. Somewhere behind the stammering, behind the constant nervousness, behind years of being told directly and indirectly that his only real value came from what his presence provided to someone else, Morty Smith kept proving, one overlooked moment at a time, that being underestimated and being less capable were never actually the same thing at all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.